In the early morning hours of the 11th of May, 1940, a British naval officer named Commander J.A.C. Hill was crossing the Nieuwe Waterweg on a Dutch pilot vessel. He was carrying 937 gold bars belonging to the Dutch National Reserve. The gold mission had been added to his orders at the last moment. The Germans had laid magnetic mines in that same waterway the previous morning. Nobody had told Hill. What you are about to discover is why a small unit of British cement workers was given the largest demolition program ever attempted by the Royal Engineers, sent into a collapsing country with no plan for their own evacuation, and then classified for 65 years after they succeeded. What you are about to discover is what happened to Commander Hill, what happened to the gold, what a British general decided about a French oil refinery that subsequently fueled German submarines, and what Churchill personally buried after reading the final report. What do you think happens when a government sends men to do something important and then decides it is not worth remembering? Tell me in the comments. Stay with this. Because what the British government authorized in the Netherlands in May of 1940 was not simply a military operation. It was a calculated decision made in secret, executed in chaos, partially successful by its own measure and largely failed by any other, and it remained unacknowledged for longer than most of the men who carried it out were alive to wait. Germany began the Second World War with a problem its generals understood and its leadership preferred not to discuss. The Wehrmacht ran on oil, the panzer divisions, the Luftwaffe, the U-boat fleet, the supply trains that fed them all required petroleum products in quantities Germany could not produce from its own soil. In 1939, over 90% of German oil was imported. 60% came from outside Europe entirely. The peak strategic stockpile, assembled in the months before the invasion of Russia, reached 56 million barrels. The Wehrmacht's campaign in Poland alone had consumed the equivalent of 64% of Germany's annual oil consumption. The arithmetic was not in Germany's favor, and the British knew it before the war began. British strategic planning had identified German oil infrastructure as a primary vulnerability before the first shot was fired. The logic was direct. If Germany could be denied the oil stored in the refineries and tank farms of Western Europe, its capacity to sustain a protracted campaign would be fundamentally constrained. At the outbreak of hostilities, the port installations of France and the Low Countries held approximately 20 million barrels, roughly 2.5 million tons, of petroleum products. That figure was in the War Office planning documents from the first week of September 1939. It represented a problem that needed to be solved before the Germans could solve it first, and the British understood, with some clarity, that their window for solving it would be narrow. The task of denying Germany that oil was initially assigned to the divisional engineers of the 12th Division. That unit was then sent to France with its division, and the task transferred, belatedly, in April of 1940, to a company-sized territorial unit that had been formed in 1932 to man coastal artillery positions in Kent. The Kent Fortress Royal Engineers had been raised by Clifford Brazier, a great war sapper who also served as works manager at the Blue Circle Cement Company's largest plant at Northfleet in northwest Kent. The unit was recruited almost entirely from Blue Circle employees. The men tasked with the largest demolition program in Royal Engineers history were, in their civilian lives, cement workers. That is not a detail to be passed over. The entire strategic calculation of the British War Office on the question of denying Germany 2.5 million tons of petroleum products rested on a territorial company raised from a cement works. Brazier had served as a sapper officer in France between 1915 and 1918 and understood what demolition under pressure required. The unit he built was recognized early as notably efficient. By early 1940, with the phony war still holding, but the intelligence picture deteriorating, he received orders direct from the Military Operations Branch of the War Office. The Kent Fortress Royal Engineers would prepare for what those orders designated XD operations, the destruction of fuel reserves in Holland and northern France, before they fell into German hands. 3 small parties were placed at 2 hours' notice. The first would target the petroleum haven and tank farms at Amsterdam. The second would target harbor installations and oil storage at Rotterdam, operating from the Hook of Holland. The third would target Flushing. No plans were made for any party's evacuation. The importance attached to the mission was considered to outweigh all other considerations. That sentence is in the record. The men carrying it out were expected to find their own way home. This was not communicated to them as a policy decision inviting discussion. It was the operational reality in which they would work. The broader task also required cooperation from every senior British officer in theater, cooperation that, as the record would eventually demonstrate, was not always given by the men in a position to give it. At 3:55 in the morning of the 10th of May, 1940, German fighter aircraft crossed the Dutch border. They flew west over the Netherlands, giving every impression of heading for England, then turned over the North Sea and came back. Paratroopers dropped on airfields near The Hague. The Rotterdam bridges were seized by airborne infantry before the Dutch garrison understood the nature of the attack. At Walhaven Airport, bombs fell in the pre-dawn dark. The Royal Netherlands Air Force had 140 aircraft, most of them outdated biplanes. 65 were destroyed on the first day. The Netherlands had maintained its neutrality since the Napoleonic Wars, had not fired a shot in the First World War, had mobilized its army in August of 1939, and had spent 9 months being reassured by Germany that its neutrality would be respected. The guarantee was worth what the equivalent guarantees to Belgium and Denmark had established them to be worth. In London, the War Cabinet assembled within hours. Among the items on the agenda was the question of Dutch and Belgian strategic stores, oil, gold, harbor infrastructure. The demolition parties were ordered to Dover before noon. HMS Whitshed left Dover Harbor at 11 in the morning. On board was Captain Peter Keeble, in command of 19 men of the Amsterdam demolition party. Their mission was to reach the petroleum haven and destroy it before the German advance could secure it. Near the Dutch coast, a German bomber attacked the ship. Whitshed opened fire and drove it off. The Amsterdam party disembarked at Ijmuiden and continued to the city by special train. HMS Wild Swan carried the Hook of Holland party, 44 men and 4 officers, to the Nieuwe Waterweg. Commander J.A.C. Hill, commanding officer of HMS Westcott, was in overall charge of the Hook of Holland demolition operation and its naval covering party. His assigned task was the harbor installations and the oil storage complex at the Pernis refinery. In Rotterdam itself, the situation at the Nederlandsche Bank's branch at De Boompjes had been deteriorating since before dawn. German machine guns controlled the approaches to the building. Dutch naval personnel were fighting street battles outside. Over the 9 months since mobilization, the bank's management had formalized plans to secure the gold reserve held there, 937 bars, 11 tons of bullion, valued at 22 million guilders, packed in wooden crates. This was a fraction of the total Dutch gold reserve, not 10% of what the country held, but it was what the Rotterdam branch contained, and it could not be allowed to pass to Germany. The Nederlandsche Bank had contacted the Bank of England. The Bank of England had contacted the Admiralty. The arrangement was for the bullion to be transported by truck to the Hook of Holland, loaded aboard a naval vessel, and removed to safety before the German advance reached the waterway. Pilot Steamer 19 moored at the Berghaven at the Hook on the afternoon of the 10th. By 7:30 that evening, the demolition detachment was aboard and the vessel was underway for Rotterdam. 6 British engineers made the approach to the bank by truck through streets where German paratroopers had been fighting Dutch forces since before dawn. Among them was a sapper named George Lechford. "We were hiding under a tarpaulin, so we stayed out of sight," he said afterward. The crates of gold were loaded at the Lech harbor. The pilot vessel waited. What nobody on that vessel knew was that the Germans had mined the Nieuwe Waterweg on the morning of the 10th of May, before the vessel had set out. The intelligence about the mines had not reached Commander Hill. It had not reached anyone aboard the pilot steamer. The vessel left for the Hook in the dark, carrying 11 tons of another nation's gold on a waterway that had already been prepared to kill it. At exactly 5:30 in the morning of the 11th of May, a German magnetic mine activated at the bottom of the waterway. The explosive detached itself from the river bottom, rose through the water column, and struck the keel of the pilot vessel under the engine room. The detonation was massive. The ship was driven upward out of the waterway. Decks tore apart. The frame split. Wreckage flew into the air. The bow and the stern fell back into the Nieuwe Waterweg separately, the bow sinking faster than the stern. Fuel oil spread across the surface and caught fire in places, throwing black smoke across the river. Within minutes, only the top of the funnel and a few meters of the foremast remained visible above the waterline, surrounded by burning oil and the debris of what had been a functioning vessel 20 seconds before. Commander J.A.C. Hill was killed in the explosion. 2 other British sailors died with him. 937 gold bars sank to the sandy bottom of the Nieuwe Waterweg. The crates had been splintered by the force of the detonation. The bars themselves settled into the riverbed in the dark below the burning surface. Over 100 tons of gold remained in the Rotterdam vault at De Boompjes, which would pass to German control 4 days later when the Netherlands surrendered. What had reached the pilot vessel was a fraction of what the country held. What reached the river bottom was all of that fraction. The salvage operation began on the 31st of May under German occupation. Divers worked the wreck from the 1st of June. The bow was brought up on the 13th of June, the stern 4 days after that. 776 gold bars were recovered from the wreck and the immediate riverbed. 161 remained missing. Dredging operations by a specialist company from Sliedrecht began in September and recovered another 40 bars in the first week. The final accounting of the remaining 121 bars is not established in the sources available. Commander Hill had been given the gold assignment at the last moment, added to his orders after the primary demolition task had already been set. Who transmitted the addition, under what authority, and whether anyone attempted to warn him about the mines already laid in his route, these are questions the consultable record may answer. The operational report filed by Commander Goodenough, dated the 17th of May, 1940, is held at the National Archives. What it contains about the intelligence known at the time of Hill's crossing is a question the archive, not this account, can settle. The Dutch salvage workers who brought up the gold bars worked in an occupied country. The bars they recovered went to Germany. At the same hour, the pilot vessel was crossing a mined waterway toward Rotterdam. Captain Keeble's party was arriving in Amsterdam on a train from IJmuiden, carrying gun cotton charges and very light pistols, with orders to destroy something the Dutch had not yet agreed to let them touch. The legal position of the Dutch commanders was not unreasonable. The Kent Fortress Royal Engineers had arrived with instructions to demolish Dutch installations on Dutch soil, belonging to Dutch companies, staffed by Dutch workers still present, without prior Dutch approval. The Dutch commanders at Amsterdam were shocked that an Allied power had sent demolition teams into their country with orders to destroy Dutch property on their own account, on the grounds of strategic necessity and without any prior consultation, was the kind of unilateralism that produces institutional friction even in peacetime. In a country invaded 12 hours earlier, it produced something closer to a formal standoff. The Dutch Supreme Command's position was that destruction could not proceed without authorization. Keeble's position was that he had his orders, and the installations needed to go before German forces reached them. Negotiations continued for 2 days while the military situation outside the conference rooms deteriorated in ways neither side could fully track from inside them. In the streets below, armed clashes between Dutch forces and German paratroopers were ongoing. Members of the National Socialistische Beweging, the Dutch National Socialist movement, were assisting the German advance where they could, having prepared for this moment since the mid-30s. The city was fighting itself and an invader simultaneously. Keeble had his motor launches on the canals and his demolition charges ready. He had reconnoitered the tank farm layouts and mapped the installation sequence at the petroleum haven. The demolition method was specific. Gun cotton charges would blow the cocks off the storage tanks, releasing oil to flood the bunded areas between the tanks and their retaining walls. Very light cartridges, standard signaling equipment, fired over the buns from the water would ignite the vapor pooling above the flooded ground. What followed would be beyond anything gun cotton alone could produce, because the oil itself would become the explosive. A signaling pistol would trigger the largest demolition the Royal Engineers had ever attempted. Permission did not arrive on the 11th of May. It did not arrive on the 12th. On the evening of the 12th, HMS Codrington arrived at IJmuiden with 4 destroyers carrying out the evacuation of the Dutch royal family. Princess Juliana, Prince Bernhard, and their 2 infant daughters departed for England that night. The country was 2 days from surrender. Keeble's party waited. Early on the 13th of May, he received the command to proceed. By that point, the Netherlands was already militarily broken. German armor had been advancing since the first day. The Rotterdam bridges had been held by airborne infantry since the 10th. The bombing of the city was less than 30 hours away. The authorization to destroy the Amsterdam installations arrived when the strategic situation that had made them worth destroying had already been resolved by events none of the people in that conference room had been able to prevent. The 13th of May, 1940, was a Monday. In the Netherlands, Monday was washing day. The gun cotton charges blew the cocks off the storage tanks. Oil flooded the bunded areas, spreading in dark sheets across the ground around the tank bases. Keeble fired the very light cartridges over the buns from the water. The vapor ignited. The tanks blew up with an explosion that carried across the city. Flames reached several hundred feet. Black smoke, dense and spreading, moved northwest across Amsterdam on the morning wind. After destroying the outlying tank farms in sequence, The party worked upwind, moving from installation to installation, demolishing each one before the smoke from the previous fire could overtake them, finishing at the petroleum haven itself. The housewives of Amsterdam had put their washing on the lines that morning. Monday was the traditional washing day, and they had no reason to know that smoke from the north side of the city would reach them. It did. No warning had been given. The demolition was a secret operation, and the people whose laundry it destroyed did not know it was happening until they could see the evidence drifting across the sky above their streets. When Don Terry, a Kent Fortress Royal Engineers veteran, drove back to the Amsterdam refinery site in 1945, a group of middle-aged Dutch women were there who remembered the Monday the fires had come. They admonished him for not having warned them. They could have brought the washing in. The largest demolition program in Royal Engineers history is remembered, from the street, across a distance of 5 years. As the morning that ruined the laundry, the canals were reported to be mined, the motor launches were abandoned. Keeble commandeered a lorry and drove with his party through a series of roadblocks toward IJmuiden. German fighter aircraft attacked them repeatedly through the afternoon until darkness fell. On the second night, hungry and close to exhaustion, operating throughout without a planned route home, they raised the destroyer HMS Havoc by radio. HMS Havoc was returning to England from the Battle of Narvik. It picked them up. Churchill had been Prime Minister for 3 days. He had been First Lord of the Admiralty throughout the planning and execution of the Dutch operations, and he had tracked the risk of Low Countries oil falling into German hands with close personal attention. He read the XD operation report. Keeble and 2 of his comrades had been recommended for the Military Cross. Churchill upgraded the recommendations to Distinguished Service Orders. The cement workers from Northfleet, who had commandeered a lorry and driven through German roadblocks with no extraction plan, would receive the DSO. He then classified the operations. While the Amsterdam fires were still burning, the other arm of the British mission in the Netherlands was reaching its own conclusion at the Hook of Holland, a conclusion different in nature and more complicated in its institutional memory. Major Joseph Hayden, commanding officer of the 2nd Battalion, Irish Guards, had departed Dover on the 12th of May. The invasion had found his unit in the middle of its leave rotation. Approximately 1/4 of the battalion was unreachable by phone or telegram. He departed under strength, reinforced by a rifle company of the 2nd Battalion, Welsh Guards, for a mission designated Harpoon Force. His orders from the War Office were precise. He was to secure the Hook of Holland for the Royal Navy, rescue the Dutch royal family and facilitate their evacuation, remove British diplomatic staff and civilians, and cover the escape route from The Hague to the coast. One restriction was explicit. He would comply with Dutch requests only if doing so would not unnecessarily endanger his men's lives. Harpoon Force arrived at dawn on the 13th of May to find the harbor in flames. German dive bombers were attacking the ships before disembarkation was complete. Dutch soldiers watching the guards arrive cheered. They had been fighting for 3 days. They had been taking casualties they could not replace. The British had come, and the assumption, reasonable on the available evidence, was that the British had come to fight. The British started digging defensive positions inside the Dutch lines. Colonel Snoek, commanding officer of the 2nd Battalion, 39th Infantry Regiment, had been optimistic when the Guards arrived. His assessment of the cooperation he subsequently received was direct. Not a single request for attacking or defending was answered. They only did whatever they liked themselves. Hayden declined a Dutch request to send his troops to Rotterdam to relieve pressure on the bridges where German paratroopers had been holding since the 10th of May. He declined a further request to deploy men to Amsterdam. His orders did not include either task, and his force lacked the equipment to engage German armor. Both refusals were operationally defensible. What they produced in the Dutch commanders watching from adjacent positions was a specific kind of institutional disillusionment. The British had arrived, the cheering had been genuine, and the British had chosen not to engage. The evacuation of Queen Wilhelmina was the element of the Harpoon Force mission that proceeded as the War Office had intended. General Winckelmann had visited her in the early hours of the 13th and told her the situation was without remedy. She had spoken on the telephone with King George VI and wept. She had protested that she would rather die at the Grebbeberg with her soldiers. She was persuaded that her constitutional role as Queen of the Netherlands and its overseas territories, as the legitimate authority Germany would need to neutralize to complete its conquest, was better served in exile than in a German prison. She boarded HMS Hereward at the Hook of Holland, intending to sail to the province of Zeeland, which had not yet fallen. Zeeland turned out to be unreachable. HMS Hereward set course for England. She wrote in her memoirs that she was fully aware of the shattering impression her departure would make at home, but considered herself obliged, for the sake of the country, to accept the risk of appearing to have resorted to ignominious flight. Churchill would describe her privately as the only real man among the governments in exile in London. On the morning of the 14th, the German bombing of the Hook intensified. The guards had improved their positions overnight. It was not enough. The Irish guards left their weapons and their equipment in the positions they had dug and ran to the ships. Dutch soldiers watching from adjacent positions grew very confused and worried. They moved into the abandoned British lines. The guards had suffered 11 killed and 20 wounded. They took their wounded with them. The weapons stayed behind. The radios had been destroyed in the bombing. A soldier climbed the vanes of a windmill and used flag signals to make contact with the destroyers waiting offshore. HMS Malcolm, HMS Vesper, and HMS Whitshed extracted harpoon force from the Hook of Holland. The Dutch soldiers who took over the abandoned British positions were holding them when the bombing of Rotterdam came. The 14th of May, 1940, began with the Dutch garrison at Rotterdam still negotiating surrender terms. German airborne infantry had held the bridges for 4 days. General Winckelmann was attempting to manage a capitulation that might spare what remained of the civilian population. At 2 in the afternoon, German bombers appeared over Rotterdam. The attack was partly the result of a communications failure. The halt order had been transmitted, but did not reach the bomber formation before it reached its target. Scores of Heinkel He-111S struck the historic city center. The fires spread for blocks. At least 1,150 people were killed, 711 of them on the 14th alone. 85,000 were left without shelter. The medieval center was destroyed. Germany then threatened to bomb Utrecht if the Dutch command did not surrender. General Winckelmann issued his proclamation to the Dutch armed forces that afternoon. This afternoon, Germany bombarded Rotterdam, while Utrecht has also been threatened with destruction. In order to spare the civil population and to prevent further bloodshed, I feel myself justified in ordering all troops concerned to suspend operations. By great superiority of the most modern means, the enemy has succeeded in breaking our resistance. We have nothing wherewith to reproach ourselves in connection with this war. Formal capitulation was signed on the 15th of May. When German forces reached the oil installations, the fires that Keeble's party and the Rotterdam demolition teams had started were still burning in places. German firefighting units extinguished them with relative speed. The Dutch academic record is direct on what followed. The demolition actions had mostly failed. Many facilities ended up in German hands, where they remained for the next 5 years. The British official position across the full XD campaign was that approximately 2 million tons of oil had been destroyed. Churchill described this as a serious blow to the German war machine. Both assessments can be accurate. They measure different things. The Dutch figure concerns what was captured in the Netherlands specifically. The British figure covers the entire campaign from Holland to the Bay of Biscay, including the weeks still to come in France. The German strategic oil account, which shows that German reserves actually increased in May of 1940 through the seizure of stockpiles across all the occupied countries combined, is the third document. Placed alongside the other two, it does not agree with either. 3 documents, 3 measurements, none of them wrong within their own terms. The German advance moved into France. New orders reached the Kent Fortress Royal Engineers, the oil installations along the lower Seine, and from there to the Bay of Biscay, remained to be addressed. French resistance to British demolitions on French soil dissolved faster than Dutch resistance had, because the Germans were arriving faster. At Rouen, Le Havre, and Honfleur, the installations were destroyed. At Rouen, the fires were visible from 20 miles. The detachment at Honfleur worked under artillery fire from German forces that had already crossed the river upstream. A large British military fuel dump near Saint-Nazaire was destroyed. The campaign was working, not everywhere. A refinery at Donge, on the Loire estuary south of Saint-Nazaire, was intact and operational when the demolition party reached it. A British general ordered that no demolition was to take place. His name is not in the available public record. His rank and the precise authority under which he issued the order are not in the available public record. What the record contains is the decision and its documented consequence. The Donges refinery was left standing. It was subsequently assessed as having been used to fuel German U-boat operations in the Atlantic. The U-boat campaign in the Atlantic between 1940 and 1943 came closer than any other single German military effort to severing Britain's supply lines. The merchant vessels those submarines sank carried food, fuel, ammunition, and the materials the British war effort required to continue. Whether the Donges refinery made a measurable difference to the operational capacity of those submarines is a question the available sources do not answer precisely. That the refinery was available to the Germans because a British general declined to authorize its destruction is in the record. His name is not. The operations elsewhere produced their own smaller catalog of failure and impossibility. A detachment sent to Dunkirk found the facilities already destroyed by German bombing on arrival. At Calais, the fighting was too heavy to approach. At Boulogne, the party was sent to destroy oil installations that had been reported with confidence and did not exist. The intelligence was wrong. The Kent Fortress Royal Engineers were sent to demolish something that was not there. Caen fell to the Germans before the British party arrived. At Cherbourg, the French authorities refused demolition of the oil facilities, and the detachment assisted instead with the harbor. Saint-Malo was the final successful operation of the campaign. The last detachment remaining on the European continent gathered at Saint-Nazaire in the third week of June 1940. The men who had spent 6 weeks destroying oil installations from the Hook of Holland to the Bay of Biscay, frequently ahead of advancing German forces, with no planned extraction routes at any stage, boarded the troopship HMT Lancastria in Saint-Nazaire Harbor on the 17th of June. At 3:50 in the afternoon, the Luftwaffe attacked. 4 bombs struck the Lancastria. She sank in approximately 20 minutes. Approximately 4,000 people died. 7 of them were members of the Kent Fortress Royal Engineers. The Lancastria disaster was the largest single incident loss of British lives in the entire Second World War. More people died in those 20 minutes in Saint-Nazaire Harbor than in any single engagement of the war before or after. Churchill ordered the news suppressed. No announcement was made to the British public. The families of the 4,000 dead learned of it from foreign radio broadcasts and from rumor in the days and weeks following the event. The suppression was justified in Churchill's private correspondence on the grounds that the public could not absorb another catastrophe so soon after the fall of France. The 4,000 dead of the Lancastria became, in official British communication, an absence, not announced, not publicly commemorated, their scale managed into silence. 7 men from the Kent Fortress Royal Engineers had spent 6 weeks destroying the oil infrastructure of occupied Europe in operations that were classified. They died on a ship whose sinking was also classified. The classification on the operations was eventually lifted. The Lancastria's suppression lasted considerably longer. For a unit whose operations remained secret, the Kent Fortress Royal Engineers came home carrying a remarkable quantity of documented recognition. Major Clifford Brazier received the Order of the British Empire. Captains Robert Keeble, Thomas Frederick Goodwin, and Bernard Buxton each received the Distinguished Service Order, the award Churchill had personally upgraded from Military Cross recommendations on reading the XD report. Second Lieutenant Bernard John Ashwell received the Military Cross. Corporal John Thomas Herndon received the Distinguished Conduct Medal. Staff Sergeant Albert Henry Smart, Sergeant Alfred Richard Blake, and Corporal Jack Mitten each received the Military Medal. It was the most decorated company-sized unit in the British Army at that point in the war. The citations accompanying those awards could not explain what they had been earned for. The operations remained classified. The men received their decorations in 1940. The public account of what earned them was not published until 2005. The operations did not end with France. The same strategic logic that had sent the unit to Amsterdam in May of 1940 applied wherever German forces threatened to capture assets that could extend their operational reach. In Greece, at the end of 1940, a company demolished oil refineries, engineering works, gas works, port facilities, and fortifications at Volos as the German advance descended from the north. Outside Athens, a new airfield and its equipment were destroyed. Some members were captured or killed before the main body could evacuate to Crete, where the Germans invaded the following May, and the survivors were split, some captured, some killed, one officer escaping through Yugoslavia to join the Chetniks, where he was subsequently killed. At Gibraltar, 9 officers and NCOs spent 4 months training local engineers for an Axis invasion that did not come. A detachment at Spitsbergen destroyed coal mines and stockpiles. At Kirkuk, in northern Iraq, where British-owned oil fields had attracted German special forces operating through Vichy, Syria, all but 3 wells required for the Eastern Fleet were filled with concrete, and the drilling rigs removed. The cement workers from Northfleet, Kent, had spent 3 years filling the world's strategic vulnerabilities with demolition charges. Most returned to Blue Circle when the war ended. Several junior officers became works managers. Peter Keeble became a director. The book Clifford Brazier wrote about the XD operations was not published until his son Jock edited and completed it 65 years after the events it described. The publisher described it as the first account. Brazier had written what he knew and died in 1959 without seeing it in print. Germany's oil position shaped every major strategic decision it made from 1942 onward. The turn south before Moscow in 1941, toward the Caucasus Fields rather than the Soviet capital, was partly driven by fuel calculations the German High Command could not resolve on any other basis. The drive to Stalingrad in 1942 was inseparable from the attempt to reach Baku. The desperate reinforcement of Hungary in the final winter of the war, while the Wehrmacht was fighting last-ditch actions in East Prussia and Pomerania, was the German High Command attempting to hold its last remaining external oil supply at Nagikanica. Germany's underlying fuel vulnerability, which British planners had identified in 1939, eventually became the constraint that made sustained large-scale German operations impossible. The XD operations were one act in a longer campaign that ended with the destruction of the Ploesti refineries and the Allied strategic bombing of German synthetic fuel plants in 1944. The logic that produced those later operations was present in the War Office documents Brazier received in April of 1940. In the Netherlands specifically, the operation was partially successful. In France, where the terrain and timeline were different, it was largely successful. At Donges, it failed, and the general, whose name the record does not preserve, made a decision whose documented consequence ran through the Atlantic campaign for years. Commander Hill has no named memorial in the sources available. He was given a last-minute assignment. He crossed a waterway that had been mined the previous morning. He was killed. The gold he was carrying sank with him. 776 of the 937 bars were eventually recovered from the river bottom. 121 are unaccounted for in the available sources. The vault at De Boompjes held over 100 tons when the Netherlands surrendered. That gold passed to Germany. Peter Keeble was 93 years old when he gave his testimony to the editor preparing the Brazier book. His memory of the events of May 1940 was described as quite remarkable, considering 63 years had passed. He had been on 2 hours' notice, crossed the North Sea on a destroyer that was bombed before it reached the Dutch coast, arrived in Amsterdam to find the Dutch had not agreed to what he had come to do, waited 2 days under fire for permission, carried out the demolition on the morning the housewives had their washing on the lines, driven through German roadblocks in a commandeered lorry with no extraction route, and been picked up at sea by a destroyer coming back from a different battle. He received the Distinguished Service Order. Then the operation was classified. When Don Terry returned to the Amsterdam site in 1945, the middle-aged women who met him remembered the Monday the smoke had come. They remembered the ruined washing. They had not known at the time, and possibly not for decades afterward, what had produced the smoke. A secret operation. 65 years before the first published account, men who went back to making cement, 937 gold bars, 776 recovered. Commander Hill, 3 British sailors killed on a mined waterway with last-minute orders. 7 Kent Fortress Royal Engineers lost on the Lancastria, whose sinking Churchill suppressed. a refinery at Donges left standing by an unnamed British general, assessed to have fueled the submarines that came closest to breaking Britain's Atlantic supply lines. A unit of cement workers carrying more decorations than any comparable formation in the Army for operations their citations could not describe, whose account took 65 years to reach print. The operational report filed by Commander Goodenough on the 17th of May, 1940, is in the National Archives. The wider XD operational files are consultable. What they contain about the decisions made, the intelligence held, and the orders given in those 5 days in May is a question the archive can answer, and this account cannot. Clifford Brazier wrote what he knew. His son published it. The men who carried it out mostly went back to their jobs. The washing that was ruined on the Monday morning of the 13th of May, 1940, is the closest thing the operation has to a public memorial. A Dutch woman, 5 years later, telling a returning veteran that he should have warned them. What do you think happens when a government sends men to do something important and then decides it is not worth remembering?